The year was 1765, about a decade before the Revolutionary War, and in South Carolina, people were roaming and going to the town square protesting King George, basically cheering for liberty. And they were saying that they were fighting against slavery of King George. But the irony of the situation, at the time, the US was the biggest slave owner of the world. What happened was the slaves saw their owners going to town square and actually protesting and calling King George they said that they were protesting against slavery. The slaves took that and started cheering the exact same protest against the protesters. It was almost a revolution within the revolution, and it's hopefully, but did not spark any curiosity about the ethical compass of what these people were actually doing. And we can see the same trickles of today if we look at some current events, just like Corona or Russia. Let's take Russia as it is more recent. The discrimination and blatant racism that we are doing towards Russians today. What is the definition of discrimination? It is discriminating someone on ethnic views. And what are we
Josh, let
seeing?
me just stop you for 1 second. It is to call out and to bear guilt onto someone for an accident of birth.
You are preventing Russian boys from playing hockey and going to the NFL, I mean the NHL, and that you are preventing Russians from playing tennis, from going to schools in some countries, from playing in chess tournaments. It is pure discrimination on a vast scale, and people are cheering for it and actually encouraging much further and deeper discrimination of these people just based upon where they were born. They say Putin bad, therefore all Russians bad, and cannot rationalize the differences. It is
Yeah.
essentially the same sort of discrimination of blacks in the 1700s, or even rednecks or any ethnic group. The same thing happened with COVID. You could be fired from your job if you didn't get the jab. You could be prevented from going to college if you did not get the jab. Or in some cases, you could not leave your country if you did not get the jab. And without the statistics of the jab out there, even if it was the greatest thing of all time, so what? If you get the jab, great. You got it. You should be safe. Discrimination and blatant racism towards different groups today really shows that people are not different. And the same people, the exact same people who would scrutinize slave owners in the past, are doing and encouraging the exact same actions today.
It's the fat person at McDonald's ordering a Diet Coke and thinking they're eating healthy. Or said another way, the best person, I think, to lie to Josh is Josh, or to Justin, Justin. The best person to lie to you is you. And you're very good at it, make no mistake.
Justin, how do you think this is able to happen, and why is it happening at such vast scales today?
I think the core part of the problem is you have a demoralization problem. Think back to, Yuri Bezdomov, not to go down that rabbit hole, but that's where I would start in terms of thinking about this. There's the meme where you have the NPC who has, the head opens up. They take out, the cartridge, like a video game cartridge or whatever, right? So for example, let's say you take out like, Rona or whatever, right? And then let's say you put in a new cartridge, let's say like, Putin bad or whatever. You put it into the head and then the eyes, get all angry. And then, you have that cartridge coming out. And then now you have, Elon Musk bad or whatever, right? Click on that front. I think what goes on is there's a really good quote from Bloom, who makes the comment that indignation is the wound of doubt. You have your financial capital to invest in, various things, GameStop or whatever, right? Just like you have your emotional capital to invest in various like ideas or whatever, right? Or beliefs. There we go. You invest your emotional capital in beliefs, and these beliefs are the foundation upon which your mind, rests and builds like its perception of who you actually are on. And I think one of the problems is that if you don't have a well-diversified base, or if you invest in concepts that fundamentally don't align with reality, now you've got a problem, because you have to go through and you have to start changing this stuff, or the base of how you view reality, and more to your point, Josh, right now, like the base of who you are, like how you define yourself, like it suddenly risks being impaired. And so I think generally to fix that, it's far easier to engage the faculties of denial, again, as Bloom would say, in order to address it. But the core problem of this is because people are demoralized, which is just a fancy way of saying the emotional capital they've invested in isn't necessarily the best. It generally comes from, a third source or a third party, which is suspect in of itself. Scott Adams oftentimes makes the remark that people's opinions are assigned to them. And I would take it a step further and say what allows, and this is, I think, maybe the direct answer to your question, finally, what allows one to have opinions assigned to him or herself is the very belief that they're immune from having opinions assigned to them in the first place. And so I think that's part of, the click click, with the NPCs going over the heads. I think that that's a large part of it. But sooner or later, and I'm really curious to see, not to, talk too much about Twitter here, but I'm really curious to see how this happens, because if the Twitter algorithm was actually working in a fair and balanced manner, nothing really should probably change. I mean, they don't adjust anything. But if the Twitter algorithm was, being, what do they call it? Like, truth and safety. I mean, it's like almost like Orwellian, what they called, whatever. But if you actually take it back and let kind of, a much more, should we say, reality aligned viewpoint and voices and thoughts to be shared, there's going to be a lot of people who've been living in fantasy land, who've been living in a digital echo chamber, who have, been living in a false reality that's made possible by censorship or de facto censorship, that are going to be in for a very rude awakening. And I think perhaps watching that will be one of the most delicious experiences of the next 10 years, as seeing as reality comes a knocking. Josh.
I originally saw this from a fantastic podcast of Dan Carlton's Hardcore
Really?
History, Blitz Human Resources. It's basically about the history of slavery and what has happened. He starts to kind of get into this about three hours into it. Every man is created equal, and they have the right to pursue life, liberty, freedom, and then the pursuit of happiness. So how can all these people who have these core beliefs in them also be slave owners and justify that? It is the same thing that we're seeing today, where people have these beliefs within themselves but do the exact opposite of what they are actually saying they believe in. It is, I don't know how someone could come to these conclusions. The only way is if you are getting your information and you are thinking is mainly a result of a external source. So if you are constantly consuming information and your identity is tied to that information, and that information starts to change, you have to change with it, because that is your identity. Like, let's go back to the slave owners. Let's just say you are a child, and you're a white child and your parents are slave owners. You see this your whole life, and your parents tell you this is how it is. They are looking at these people as commodities. And if that's the case, well, you're going to grow up thinking, well, everyone grows up thinking that the parents know everything in the world, and you're going to see all your friends doing the exact same thing. So you're going to grow up thinking that slavery is just normal and ethically right. So you will then probably become a slave owner. There are, of course, small portions of people who revolt against the crowd and do not think with the rest of the people. But as an overwhelming majority, you are just going to do what those before you did.
Yeah.
So the same thing's
And
happening today.
just a fancy way of saying that if you were alive back then, you probably would have been on team consensus versus team non-consensus, or pick any, thing in history that we can look through with hindsight. Chances are you probably would have been on the bad guy team versus the good guy team, even though we all love to think, of course, we'd be on the good guy team. But
The Germany was the most atrocious atrocity in human history, and say that they would never do anything like that. But even in Nazi Germany, they allowed people to leave. So Hitler's would be proud to see Australia and Canada preventing unvaccinated or Jews to leave the country, because that they can't do that in Australia or Canada.
whenever people like to, get all hot and bothered about one of the great moral outrages and sins, and don't get me wrong, there's certainly been those in the past, you kind of want to ask the question, well, like, what led to this? So again, like, if people want to say, like, oh my God, how could the Germans possibly elect Hitler? The obvious answer is the Weimar Republic, but especially the current version of the left doesn't like to talk about that. And if you want to know the story behind that story, just look at the Frankfurt School and you can get a really good idea of what was going on there. But again, that's a separate video on that regard. Same thing with slavery. You can look at the story behind the story there, and you can say, there's more to this. It's not just people who suddenly woke up one day and thought, oh, well, let's do this. No, there were some other things that kind of led this onto it. And lastly, what I would say too is that people talking about original sins of the various countries, individuals, cultures, or whatever, everyone's guilty. But Kevin Samuels and Thomas Sowell have done, I think, a really good job of identifying one of the key challenge points, that the left likes to ascribe to the legacy of slavery. That otherwise impede the African American community. And if you read Sowell or listen to what Samuel says, you'll see that it's, well, I mean, of course, slavery probably had something to do with it, but Thomas Sowell in Black Rednecks and White Liberals does a really good job of detailing in his very good way, and in a very powerful way of saying it's not the most correct narrative that's out there. Basically, Samuels would say, or this is me poorly trying to express what Samuels would say, is that the original sin of the Black community was circa 1960 or so. The Black woman opted to marry the state over the Black man. This basically led to a degradation in the Black family, which then ultimately opened up a Pandora's box of other problems that we all are struggling with today. But again, I think it's a very interesting take. It's much more nuanced take, and I would say my own personal opinion, probably much more accurate take than just, oh my God, racism bad, and this is all the fault of slavery. Again, racism, of course, is bad, and yes, there are the sustained impacts of slavery. I don't think anyone's not saying that. But to say it is only this, and these are the only two metrics we have to describe the situation we find ourselves in, I don't know if that's...
People look at things so black and white. You say, oh, Abraham Lincoln is good. He freed the slaves. He was a slave owner, and he was never against slavery. He changed his mind late into the elections because he knew that it was going to poll correctly. He was never against slavery, and in fact, in his early days, he was for it because that's what the polls were looking for. Politicians are all the same, and you can't look at things black and white. Elon Musk, he has his pros, he has his cons, and you have to understand both of them. So
Absolutely.
I would say the people today who think that they are so ethically correct will look back. Well, I don't think they'll ever have the guts to admit it, but I'm sure history will show us that the people discriminating against the Russians, the people blatantly racist towards the unvaxxed, we're going to see later in history that they were on the wrong side of the fight. And I'm thinking that they will see atrocities on their side.
The woke mobs or the woke cultures on the left, when they reflect back, let's say 20 or 30 years from now, they will either reflect back in horror as of what they allowed themselves to believe, or they will reflect back in pure delusion because they are so detached from reality as they lack the mental capacity to actually process and understand it.
Well, guys, thank you for watching, and we will see you on the next one.